Thank you. Thank you. That's actually the perfect end and segue into some of the questions that I'd like to ask. So for the rest of we're ending at 2, so we have 45 minutes to have a discussion, hopefully a robust discussion. And we'll start with a few questions I have. I'll kind of take advantage of my moderator's privilege, and then we will go to the Q&A. So if attendees want to add questions, they can. I can't promise I'll get to all of them, but I will try. But as I listen to all of this rich discussion, there are many kind of key themes that come up. So the first, I just want to state the obvious. We're talking about 50 Muslim majority countries, and you also have countries like India and other countries who have large Muslim minorities, and that totals 1.5 billion people. So as a result, it would be foolish to approach any issue related to Islam or Muslims as if there is some kind of simple or consistent solution or analysis. Arguably, we should have 50 different analyses for every country, and then different analyses when you have large Muslim minorities. Because I think what we all know is every country is different. And so the first thing I want to kind of start with is debunking the myth, this homogeneity and this essentialization of people simply because they share a common religion, even though they may have different interpretations, different even sects of the religion, different practices within that same religion. So as a result, the question I have is, can we even analyze blasphemy laws in the abstract? Obviously, we can have a theological discussion, which many of you did, but as some of the other speakers mentioned, it's, the interest, I think the impetus for this panel is because of the practical implications, right? And the different ways in which individuals, either acting as vigilantes, right, or states where they're using their monopoly over the use of force, legitimate use of force, and laws to implement, to legislate and enforce blasphemy laws. So I think one thing that I hope we can do through the discussion is really try to address it based on a particular country or perhaps a particular school of thought that may then apply to different countries. So my question is really about the secular versus religious legal divide, because one of the difficulties in analyzing or discussing quote unquote Islamic law is that one could argue, is there any country in the world right now that actually has a legal system that is an Islamic law system? Saudi Arabia, perhaps, Iran, perhaps, but I don't think any of the other Muslim majority countries, maybe Indonesia. I don't know the answers to these, but I do know that we talk about Islamic law as if there are even nation states that is their complete system, whereas the common model is really primarily secular law that is inherited by former colonial states in Europe, and then this mishmash of secular law that is, again, brought in from outside. Maybe some of it becomes indigenous through evolution, and then you add some Islamic law elements, with the exception of possibly family law, which tends to be more kind of consistent with Islamic law as one would theologically define it. And I'll just note that I am very suspicious that Islamic law is dominant in family law because that's where women's rights are implicated the most. So then you intersect with patriarchy, and it gets even more complicated. So I guess all that is to say, I'd like to kind of ask the question, and I'd like to ask Dr. Khalid Abou Fadl first, is how do you analyze blasphemy law, when you have 50 different countries and when you have secular law that is always interacting with Islamic law? And so where do we start? How do we understand blasphemy and Islamic law in this very complicated legal political context?
Sahar, that's a very good question, and because yes, we are. I think people of conscience are offended when we see Muslims respond to perceived blasphemy or actual blasphemy or slander of their religious symbols, whatever they are, in violent ways. I mean, it's an embarrassment. But when it comes to that note of caution about how to approach blasphemy laws, because the truth of the matter is, Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence has not survived the colonial moment. It has been deconstructed quite purposely through colonialism, and all manifestations of Islamic law since colonialism are an extension of the colonial moment. So let me just very quickly give just a quick couple examples. Saudi, okay, who has been put to death or under threat of being put to death because of that class of laws that we can call blasphemy laws? Well, Saudi put to death a very, very prominent Shia scholar. I mean, in Nimr, one of the best, in my views, one of the best minds in the modern age on Sharia law, and he was executed. Part of the charges against him were apostasy and blasphemy, but everyone knows that this is because Nimr supported the Arab Spring and issued a very famous fatwa where he said that demonstrating against governments is an Islamic right. It's a matter of an actual haqq given by God. Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, who is a very prominent Saudi scholar, a very impressive scholar. I mean, his son is in the U.S. One of his sons is in the U.S. The family, has been in prison under threat of, again, being put to death. And when you look at what constitutes blasphemy and apostasy, it's his opinions about despotism. Salman al-Auda himself is under threat of being put to death, a very prominent scholar. In a country like Egypt, Egyptian law, and you're an expert in Egyptian law, I mean, is dira' al-adyan. And then where did that language come from? It doesn't come from Islamic law. It doesn't come from the Islamic legal tradition. You could be charged with dira' al-adyan. It actually comes from a translation of a French legal opinion. I mean, it's sort of a literal translation. That, of course, I mean, it's sort of jumping on a French legal opinion. But anyway, and when you see the way Egypt has applied this isdira' al-adyan, which literally translates into disrespecting or dishonoring religion, it's all over the place. I mean, a rather famous atheist / apostate like Sharif Gaber had a prison sentence. He served of a year in prison. He served a part of it. But at the same time, another person who has very famously critiqued the historicity of the Bible, the Coptic Church complained to the Egyptian government about him, and so he was arrested under the charges of isdira' al-adyan. So I hear you that the picture is far from stereotypical when we get to country by country analysis. I shouldn't go too long. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. And we have Mr.
And the name of the guy that was complained about by the Coptic Church and was imprisoned was Ahmed Sibia, by the way, just so in case people want to look up what I'm talking about. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, and I think it's an important point that you really can't understand blasphemy law or how the people are engaging with it or the government's engaging with it without understanding the political context. Just in the same applies to France versus Spain versus Netherlands versus the UK. And so I just want to make that point that we've got to stop treating 1.5 billion people as if they're all robots and they're the same, and 50 different countries as if they're all the same when there's different languages. And so I just want to make sure we make that point. Professor Kuru and Dr. Mustafa Akil, you both have comments. Mustafa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. By the way, I'm not a doctor, but I appreciate the compliment. Thank you so much. I should say that. I think Professor Fadl's emphasis on blasphemy against the political ruler, right? I mean, the dictator, is also a very interesting aspect of this problem we're speaking about, because a lot of the people who will champion blasphemy laws will also say, you cannot speak against the ruler. That's fitna, right? I mean, that's the standard view of Saudi Arabia, which reveals a culture where authority is, or respect to the authority is imposed by coercion, not won by, the speech and grace and so on and so forth. Like, authority has to punish you for any word that is disrespectful, you may say. It has secular versions too. I mean, in my country, Turkey, we had a law banning insulting Ataturk from 1920s on. We have a law that banned insulting the president, and it's been used incredibly, draconian way in the past 8 years. President Erdogan, more than 100,000 people have been sued for insulting the president online and so on and so forth. So I think beneath the layer of this blasphemy law in Islam we're speaking about, there is a kind of a authoritarian culture which doesn't come from Islam, but maybe influenced Islam. I think we should speak about that too. But one more thing, Sahar, you're absolutely right that the legal traditions of Muslim countries are quite diverse. Some of them pretty secular. Some of them have Islamic law only in the family law. Most of Arab countries are like that. A few of them are explicitly, claiming that the Sharia is law of the land. But still, I think this doesn't negate the importance of thinking through blasphemy laws. First of all, blasphemy laws do not only lead to legal punishment, it leads to vigilante violence, right? That's a big, so those people are driven by not any secular law, but their conviction that whoever punishes the prophet should be punished. And legally, for example, in Pakistan, there was a colonial law about blasphemy, banning blasphemy. It was already there. So there is a colonial heritage here. But it was made much more severe during the Islamization of laws under General Zia-ul Haq. So if people have certain convictions, they can put it into legislation, even in a relatively or nation state context or a secular context. So you're absolutely right that it's diverse and not every Muslim society has the same patterns, but religious convictions do play a role in issues like this, in blasphemy or apostasy as well, I think.
Thank you. Professor Kuru?
Thank you, Sahar, for the question. In my field, comparative politics, we do similar comparison about Catholic countries. From 1972 to 1991, 95% of Catholic countries were authoritarian. And there was a Catholic question. Of course, every Catholic country had its own peculiarities, and we need experts on each of them. But the Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965 took the problem seriously, because until that time, the Catholic Church was denying democratic liberal values. Pope Pius in 1877 declared the idea of separation between church and state as a damned idea. And the idea that every individual can choose his or her religion is a condemned idea. But in the Vatican's Second Council, Catholic Church reversed those opinions and views. And then because of many geopolitical and otherwise reasons, Catholic world, so quote unquote, have experienced a democratization from Portugal and Spain to Latin America. Now we have two different audiences. To the Western audience, I absolutely agree with you that American students and everybody should know that Islamic world is very diverse. But we also have a Muslim audience from Turkey to Iran, from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. I have many friends, followers, and students. And they define themselves as Muslim because all the countries are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And Islamist, populist Islamist ideology are very influential in many of them. In terms of constitution and legal system, out of 50 Muslim majority countries, 20 of them have secular constitutions. 20 of them have constitutions referring to Sharia, either as the source of law or a source of law or as a veto principle. And 10 of them are mixed without being secular or referring to constitution as Sharia. But in family law, as you said, that's the main issue. But let me conclude saying that the blasphemy and the issue is a part of teaching in madrasas. It's a part of teaching in mosques. And a famous Moroccan scholar, Jabiri, says that if you ask me to summarize Greek culture, I say the culture of philosophy. And if you ask me to pinpoint scholars to defining British and French philosophy, I said Descartes for French, Locke for Britain. If you ask me for Arab or Muslim, I say Shafi. And Imam Shafi is Usul al-Fiqh. So, and he is not saying that to give credit to Shafi, no, to criticize, saying that this fiqh views is very formal understanding of Islam, not the beauty Dr. Fadl emphasized. And according to fiqh interpretations, freedom of speech is very limited thing. And regardless whether the country is secular or Sharia based, we see the problem. Let me conclude with Turkey. Secular republic, the first Turkish secular constitution. And now we have singers condemned and sometimes put in jail by having blasphemy or restriction of freedom of speech. So even in secular states, populist Islamist discourses are becoming more and more influential, restricting expression of and freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Radwan, Dr. Radwan?
Yes, I just want to add a very small point, but I think it's been mentioned, especially by Dr. Khalid Abdul Fadl, the fact that this is definitely tied to the lack of democracy in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. We are mostly ruled by dictators, whether in the name of religion or in the name of secularism. They are dictators who do not want any debate. By definition, they are afraid of any debate about religion or about politics. So they tend to, clamp down. We don't want any discussion, any real debate about Islam itself or about the role of religion in politics or about politics itself. Everything is banned. So really, this is, in my opinion, really part of the struggle for democracy in Arab countries and in Muslim countries. We need to establish real democracy. The second point is, of course, we also need ijtihad. I've been speaking about ijtihad for 20 years, also as part of CSID, because yes, we need a modern interpretation of Islam, but that modern interpretation of Islam that is valid for the 21st century has to be genuine, has to come from within Islam itself, from within the scholars of Islam, from within the traditions of Islamic teachings and Islamic interpretation of the text. It takes time. It's very difficult. It needs freedom and democracy, but also we need to engage the religious scholars, the religious leaders in all these countries about all these questions of freedom, of democracy, of human rights, including the blasphemy laws. So it's a long struggle. In Tunisia, in the last 10 years, we have trained over 2,500 imams, more than 50% of the imams in the country. We had programs to train religious leaders and imams in Tunisia on democracy, on human rights, on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and all these values. And I think that is really important and essential to modernizing our interpretation of Islam.
Thank you. So I will now turn to some of the Q&A questions, and I might bundle a few of them together if there's some common themes. So we have two questions which I think are related. The first one is, how are you all as scholars suggesting that blasphemy laws be modified or eliminated, which is both a kind of legal, theological, and political question. And then the second question is, instead of fighting against these laws, should we get more success in defining and advocating how Muslims should respond to blasphemy. And this kind of touches on the vigilantism that's happening that is against the laws of the state, right? I think what's really important is that when we hear of these egregious cases, which often are the only cases we hear about when we're talking, say, about coverage of Pakistan, we only hear about all these awful things that happen, and we're not hearing about the good things that happen in that country, whether in the name of Islam or not, is, nobody seems to discuss that this is actually against the law. People, even if there is blasphemy law on the books, it doesn't give license to people to go and murder and kill people without going through the legal system. And then the separate issue is whether blasphemy law on the books, is worthy of critique, and how is it justified through kind of theological bases. So the question is really a reformist question. So there's obviously a theological component to it. Is what are your positions that Islamic law does not allow for blasphemy law at all? Or is it that no, blasphemy law is permissible, but it's really about the way in which it's currently existent in country X or country Y, that's Muslim majority, and it's not, and it needs to be changed to be more aligned with Islamic law principles. So I will open that up to who wants to take. I see Professor Kuru, do you want to start?
Very quickly, in the European model, they first stop using the law, make it a dead letter in the book, then eventually start to repeal that away. Second, Ridwan and many others emphasize democratization, but we should also be clear about the concept. I recently reviewed a book defining Qaradawi as a Muslim Democrat. But then I say Qaradawi had in a famous or infamous speech says that if we didn't kill apostates in the time of Abu Bakr, we couldn't keep Islam. And he strongly support the idea. And then I say, how come someone defending killing the apostate presented as a Democrat? So the concept of democracy definitely requires a very deep respect to freedom of speech. Last but not least, in Pakistan and elsewhere, you are right that they are criminals who did the lynching. But we should not forget popular support. In Pakistan, the bodyguard who assassinated and murdered Punjab governor, then executed by the government of Pakistan and the courts, then radical in Pakistan established a political party to declare this murder as a murder. And it's now receiving 10% or so votes. So there is a very sociological problem we are seeing, radicalization in societies. That's really concerning. Thank you.
Thank you. Mustafa?
I'm sorry. There's no clear pathway here, but here's what I would say. First of all, my argument is that there is no basis for blasphemy laws in the Quran and Sunnah. So our religion doesn't call for it, despite the medieval jurisprudence. Now, this doesn't mean that states cannot make laws, separate from religion. States can do laws. Even in the classical Islam, you had the idea of state had to have taze punishments and so on and so forth. But there, then I would say it's not helpful and it's not right in itself. And I think one thing that Muslims who are discussing this issue should take into consideration is that when the idea of a blasphemy law becomes a norm in the world, it is not also good for us, especially when we are minorities, because in a Hindu majority country, Hindu mobs can come after you because with the beef you're eating, you're disrespecting Hindu religion and so on and so forth, which is happening in India, of course. So I think we should have a more serious conversation about this notion of freedom of speech. And generally, freedom of speech comes to us as something that the West is advocating that for their own agendas and so on and so forth. And sometimes the West can have double standards or some agendas indeed or not. That's a different question. But is this a value that we really need? Our religion doesn't call for blasphemy laws, plus freedom of speech is a good thing. Because when we don't have it, we have dictators who silence speech in our countries and oppress us. When we don't have freedom of speech, Muslims intellectuals who just have different ideas from the mainstream can be targeted, killed, and condemned, which has happened in Egypt, Sudan, and in various countries over the decades. So this is a value that we need. And again, finally, we should not, I don't advocate freedom of speech so that I hear all the nasty words, but the fact that I think we will bring more respect to Islam is precisely we won't have these laws and blasphemy or apostasy. I think by having these things, we are only provoking disrespectful words to Islam, as we have seen in the past couple of decades, especially in the West. How will we go there? It's a huge transformation, but let's not forget that we were able to abolish slavery. It wasn't easy. There were people who were defending slavery 150 years ago, saying that it's in the Sharia. Ultimately, it dawned on too many Islamic scholars to say that it wasn't what Islam wanted. It just Islam founded it, and ultimately we wanted to abolish it. Now we can only do it. So these changes are possible, but it needs intellectual effort. It needs scholars to speak out. There are many scholars who are speaking out. And on that note, I should also say I would recommend a phenomenal book published 2 years ago, Freedom of Speech in Islam, Challenging Blasphemy and Apostasy Laws, written by a team of scholars, edited by the great Pakistani scholar Muhammad Khalid Masood, who has some of the many of the facts that we're speaking today. So there are efforts like this, and I think Muslim media should give them more voice. We should have more probably conversations like this.
Thank you. And Dr. Abu Fadl, I want to turn to you, but I just want to make one point. We want to be careful. We are in the United States, and so we are socialized, I think, to privilege and perhaps fetishize American free speech rights, and to take a very purist and expansive approach. But the people on the other side of the Atlantic that are supposed to be kind of within the same historical tradition don't have the same approach, right? In France and in Germany and in the UK and others, where there are hate speech laws. And we've certainly paid a price for having a very expansive free speech environment where we've got polarization, we've got hate crimes, we've got minorities who are in fact living second-class lives because many people who are quite powerful and influential can say things that are very harmful and have real impact on minorities, including Muslims. And so this isn't me saying that we necessarily should abolish or change our free speech model, but we should acknowledge that there is a cost and there are certain groups that pay a higher burden, and that sometimes allowing people to say whatever they want that is very insidious and hateful and harmful and often false can also be harmful to society, right? And can have divisive effects that other countries may say we don't want that in our society. So I just want to make sure that we're not kind of just copying and pasting the imperfect American model. But before I get to you, Dr. Khalid Abu Fadl, I see that Dr. Bashir has his hand up, and then I definitely want to hear Dr. Khalid's comments, especially on the theology of blasphemy laws and whether we could have, whether Islamic law requires it or not. Dr. Bashir?
Oh, I have a very simple question. The blasphemy laws are devised to discourage blasphemy. What I am seeing is encouraging the blasphemy. So are these laws applicable today where it is not serving its purpose? So I have a very strong recommendation. Number one, that all Sharia laws must be revised because these are devised by human beings based on their interpretation of Quran and Prophet's teaching, and this was devised in the medieval period. Are we interpreting the Quran the same ways, or it has changed our understanding of the world and we have to revise our interpretation? But the most important point is, if it is not serving its purpose, if it is increasing the blasphemy, why should we have the blasphemy laws? Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Abu Fadl? You're muted.
Oh yeah, I'm pressing on the wrong button. Sorry. No, thank you, Sahar. Listen, okay, so there have been actually fairly good works challenging the legality of apostasy, punishment of apostasy, and punishment of blasphemy. I mean, in English, Muhammad Hisham Kamali wrote a book, Freedom of Expression in Islam. And also I should flag Muhammad Khalid Masood's book. I think that's a book that was just mentioned as well. And there have been people like Gamal al-Banna in Arabic who's written about this extensively and again challenged the same. And I agree that punishing blasphemy or apostasy is very difficult to reconcile with the normative ethics of the Quran. I mean, the Quran, I think, could not have been more clear. Man sha'a falyu'min wa man sha'a falyakfur. فذكر ما أنت إلا مذكر لست عليهم بمسيطر. So remind them or call or invite them to the faith, but you don't control them, and you have no authority to control them. And we can unpack, and some scholars have unpacked how the historical decision made to fight the apostasy wars was interpreted by Muslim jurists to say, well, you know, what Abu Bakr did was not inconsistent with the Quran, because if Abu Bakr made the decision to fight those who apostated from Islam, that it must be right to punish those who commit apostasy. And I think it is time for us to get serious about our history and reclaim our history and reinterpret our jurisprudence by liberating it from sometimes the heavy shackles of history. But Sahar, what I want to say the problem is that in order for people to have a reasoned discussion about their history, they must take their history seriously and with an open mind. And we are a people, and I say this, and I hope it doesn't shock anyone. We are a people in the modern contemporary moment without a history. I think we don't take our history seriously. We don't take our historical. I mean, compare European historiography to, or even emerging historiography on Asia, to the historiography on the Islamic civilization. I mean, the works produced in Arabic and Persian and Turkish are reductive and derivative, and for the most part, marginal. And the authoritative voices about Muslim history still remains in the West. And if you can't reclaim your history, if you don't control your own history, then you're always in a reactive mode. What often happens with reform, I'll give you just one example. And again, I'll give the example of Egypt. Okay, so I knew, and he used to be a friend, this man called Ibrahim Isa, right? And Ibrahim Isa is supposed to be this reformer, right? And I used to take Ibrahim Isa seriously, and I used to actually like him as a liberal, daring, revolutionary thinker. But suddenly, everything Ibrahim Isa said immensely repulses me. When I saw Ibrahim Isa completely subservient, a complete sellout to a despot who's equal to the Pharaoh himself, Pharaoh. In the Quran, who's the prototype of despotism? It's Pharaoh, the Pharaoh. And so here is a pharaoh that is constantly telling us Islam needs to be reformed, and puts Ibrahim Isa as his mouthpiece, one of his mouthpieces, to tell us how, we should be critical of the legacy of the companions, we should be critical of the legacy of the prophet, we should be critical of this, critical of that, we should reinterpret everything. And the minute you come close, even hint any criticism of Sisi and his government, suddenly the liberality, all the liberalism of Ibrahim Isa ceases to be. And you go into, psychotic fits. Oh, no, you can't say anything. Are you blaming Sisi? Are you really criticizing? The same thing was Nawal Saad, the late Nawal Saadawi, who I knew quite well. And, you banned Muhammad Amara, an Islamic thinker, who, by the way, was very critical of blasphemy laws and apostasy law. Sisi's government banned Muhammad Amara from appearing on TV, from publishing in any literary outlet. Similarly banned Fahmi Huwaidi, who was also a critic of blasphemy laws and apostasy laws. And you embrace Ibrahim Isa and Nawal Saadawi, and then people wonder, why isn't it that Muslims are reclaiming and reinterpreting bravely their tradition? Because it's all screwed up. Because it's really, really messed up. Because the minute the Muslim starts dreaming of liberty and democracy and rights, there are so many forces that line up to say, no, you're an exception to humanity. You're not entitled to these things. And that type of racism, to put it quite simply, bluntly, is a deconstructive racism that locks the Muslim mind in an endless pathology that the Muslim mind can't break out of. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I have to put a plug in for The Racial Muslim, my book.
Yes, absolutely. I used it in my class. And by the way, Sahar, all the students in the class agreed that was their favorite reading of all the books I've assigned.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Tell them I said thank you. And because I agree with you. I think that and this is what people who don't study this very diverse Muslim world that we call one, but Muslim majority societies, I don't think appreciate, is not only are they all very different, but that there are so many forces that are producing these results. And it's not simply theological interpretations, right? Or religious zealotry. It's so complicated, like any nation, and that sometimes you will see this bad outcome, and you shouldn't assume it's just this direct causal line between religious zealotry or kind of medieval thinking and then vigilantism, whether it's against women or it's against religious minorities or it's against religious dissidents. Oftentimes there are so many different factors at play, and that's not to be apologist, because there certainly are religious zealots all over the world that are Muslim and that are Christian and that are Jewish and that are Hindu and that are of different faiths. But it's just the way in which we, in the West anyway, we only direct all of that criticism at Islam, at Muslim majority societies. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like Professor Kuru and Mr. Aikyo to comment, because I see their hands up. And then I want to make sure that we give Dr. Bashir and Dr. Masmoudi an opportunity to say any closing remarks. So Mustafa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Dr. Fadl made another good point that there are these authoritarian countries in the Gulf, sometimes whose leaders come up with reformists of Islam. They said Islam should be reformed, and by that they mean allowing women to drive a car or something, which of course should happen. That's an important reform. But I would say, yes, Islam should be reformed, and the first thing we need, the Islamic understanding needs reform. But the number one reform we need is a teaching which says the ruler should be obeyed even if he's a tyrant, which is explicitly said, unfortunately. in some of our classical texts, and of course upheld by these regimes. So, I mean, the political authoritarianism cannot be justified by making some cosmetic reforms on here and there. So, and I think that's a very important point. One thing though on Sahar, you made a great point, and may I slightly disagree with all the respect. The difference between US and US standards of free speech and European ones. That's true. US standards of freedom of speech and religion is generally higher than European ones, as in particular France. And I have the full conviction that the US standards are better for everybody, including us. Just look at religious expression, you know, like, I mean, look at the headscarf bans, hijab bans in France. Look at the bans they're creating now on separatism. I mean, an imam was just expelled in France because he's doing separatism, right? Whereas with First Amendment rights in the US, I think Muslims have more freedom to say what they say, even if it doesn't go well with the common sensibilities of society. Let's not forget that hate speech laws can be used against us as well. Someone can say, oh, there's some hate speech in the Quran. What? Unbelievers will go to hell. That's so disrespectful to atheists. And well, that's what the Quran says, you know, that's our teaching, like it or not. So, and there are people who actually go against the Quran with that argument in this Islamophobic politician in Holland, for example. So in a medium of freedom, there will be terrible things to hear, but I think a medium of freedom is better for everybody. Of course, when it doesn't turn into a religion, into incitement and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make that point, you know, and that is, I think, the key issue when we're discussing these things. Is this idea of free speech and freedom of religion fundamentally a good thing for everybody, and including us Muslims as well? And my answer is yes. Thank you.
That's a fair contention. This is a hot topic of debate in legal circles, but there's no perfect system, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so we just want to acknowledge that. I think my point was that we're very quick to point out the downsides to the European model, but I don't think that we acknowledge the downsides to our model, so that we at least decide intentionally and purposely, are we willing to pay that price, and who's paying those prices? And yes, inevitably, whenever you have rules, it's those who get to make those rules that will make them in a way that benefits them. I think that's just the human condition, unfortunately. Professor Kuru, you had a comment,
Yes.
and then Dr. Bashir,
Yes.
the third one, and then we'll close out. Yes.
So very quick, three things. First, I agree with Mustafa that there should be harm principle. As long as we do not harm each other, there should be freedom of speech. Second, books mentioned, very good. And a recent one, Mohsin Kadiwar, Blasphemy and Apostasy in Islam, from both Sunni and Shia. He is from Shia tradition, but also referred to Sunni. Last but not least, to clarify for the audience that we are not simply discussing apostasy as those who say, I was Muslim, I live Muslim, self-confess apostasy. No, because since the time of at least Ghazali's declaration of Ibn Sina and Farabi as apostates, Muslims who says, I am Muslim, still declare apostate for very simple things that in Turkish we say elfaz-ı küfür. When I was a child, they taught me that if, for example, the Prophet likes to eat eggplant, and if I say I don't like eggplant, I became a kafir. So this is a childish definition of apostasy, but the established norm in fiqh, if the ulama has an ijma, like for example, beer is haram. If a Muslim reformist come up with the idea that no, beer can be halal, they can declare the person apostate. This is a very serious issue that close any internal discussion about Islam and make people fearful of being declared as a non-Muslim, although you pray 5 times a day, you are fasting and doing everything and declare yourself Muslim, still with a single idea, even thinking that idea in your mind, oh, maybe beer is halal, automatically you become an apostate. That's a very dangerous view and close down any internal debate in Islam. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bashir?
Yeah, just a very brief response. I think is boiled down to that we are talking about freedom of speech. And it's becoming a very complex issue. Hundreds of articles are written, and I have read Professor Abul Fadl, scholarly writings, Shaykh Albani, I have read about it, Professor Kamali from Malaya, and several seminars have been held. I think it's time that we need to initiate a movement to seriously revise or abolish the blasphemy laws. In fact, the entire Sharia law has to be reviewed. There is no reason why we simply have to accept what is written in 7th to 11th century, and after that it is stopped. So I request all the professors to think about how can we initiate a movement to revise and to abolish these laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Masmoudi, you have the final comments?
Well, my final comment is, again, thank you all very much for very, very insightful discussion. Obviously, we need more of these debates. We need more of these discussions. It's a long-term project to change the situation in the Muslim world and to change the mindset, not only of the religious leaders and establishment, but also of the Muslims in general, the people in general in these countries. It leads me to one final question that I think is very important and very relevant is, who speaks for Islam? Authoritarian regimes, of course, they want to claim that they do, they speak for Islam. Or they create an institution like Al-Azhar University, and they try to say, okay, Al-Azhar University speaks for Islam. The problem is under a dictatorship, like in Egypt today, Al-Azhar University cannot really have the freedom to say what it wants. It basically has to repeat whatever the government is saying, So if there is no freedom, then there is not even an institution to speak for Islam. But more than that, in true Islam, there is no institution to speak for Islam. In true Islam, there is no one to speak for Islam. All of us speak for Islam. All of us are, as Muslims, have the right to say our opinion and what we think Islam is. There is no one, there is no authority that speaks in the name of Islam or in the name of God. It complicates things, it makes it interesting. In my opinion, it makes it more democratic, not less democratic, that we don't have a church or an institution that says, this position, my position, is the only official position of Islam, the only true position of Islam. And if you disagree with me, you're not a real Muslim or a good Muslim. There is no such institution in Islam. In reality, we all speak for Islam, and it's time that we speak louder and that we become more organized, and we take our right back to defend and define what Islam is. In the end, it's we have to convince the majority of Muslims. That's the real test. We have to convince the majority of the Muslims in the world or here in America that what we are saying is true, that what we are saying is genuine, and what we are saying reflects the true values of Islam, not imposed by this regime or that regime or this university or that university. It's a matter of conviction. And we have a lot of work to do. And I hope that we can all join hands and continue the struggle for freedom and democracy and freedom of expression all over the world, but especially in the Muslim world. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Sahar, for wonderful moderation of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I hope that everyone that watched will follow up by reading our work, all of the scholars' works. There is actually a bibliography on Muslims and Islam in America, all the books about Muslims and Islam in America that you can Google and you'll find it very easily. And then finally, keep up with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy and the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that I lead. I've got to put a plug in for that. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next event.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank
It's
you.
an honor. Thank you.
Salam alaikum.
Thank you. Alaikum salam.
Salam.